Okay, my name is Jerry, and let me explain firsthand why I'm wearing this thing. We're taping this session today for no good reason that I'm aware of, but we're all going to be on tape. So if you have any questions, make sure they're intelligent questions because you're going to be on the air. I'm going to take a few more minutes of your day today to talk to you about my experience as a young boy. I should say a young Jewish boy who grew up in Germany during the Hitler years. About a year ago, there was an article in the Detroit Free Press. Not many people saw it. It was on an inside page. But it caught my eye because the heading was Jewish Kids Targeted. And this is in St. Louis, Missouri. And it said at least 4 students from Parkway West Middle School faced punishment for allegedly hitting Jewish classmates during what they called Hit a Jew Day. And then as recently as last November, another article in the local paper. This is in Florida, Naples, Florida. 10 Florida middle school students were suspended for participating in Kick a Jew Day. Now, I'm not talking about Nazi Germany in the 1930s. I'm talking about the United States of America in the 21st century. But to me, it brought back a lot of memories to my days in Germany when hitting Jews, kicking Jews, killing Jews was a policy of the government, the Nazi government, that was in power at that time. Maybe what I should do is tell you a little bit about myself, if I may. I traced my family back as having lived in Germany into the early 1700s. That's before the American Revolution. And we consider ourselves Germans, good, loyal German citizens who happen to practice the Jewish faith. Similar to you in this room, consider yourselves Americans who practice Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, whatever your faith happens to be. And it wasn't until Hitler came along that we were told, no, you're not Germans, you're Jews. And as Jews, you're fit only for slave labor and eventual extermination. My dad volunteered to fight for Germany in the war that became known as World War I. Nobody called it World War I at that time because nobody knew that 20-some years later there'd be World War II. World War I, ironically, was called the Great War or the War to End All Wars. As we all know, it didn't quite work out that day. My dad was wounded in that war. He received shrapnel wounds in both of his legs and received a medal which the Germans call the Iron Cross, which is like the Purple Heart that an American soldier receives, a medal that he wore with pride. He came home from that war. He survived. He fully recovered from his wounds. As a matter of fact, and I mention this for a reason, he took up tennis and skiing as a hobby. He went to law school and became an attorney, and we lived in the city of Frankfurt, Germany. Now, Germany, as I'm sure you all know, lost that war. And the Allied forces, United States, England, France, Italy, even Japan, was on the side of the Allies in World War I, wanted to be certain that Germany would not start another war. So they pretty well stripped the German factories of anything that they could use to manufacture war material, guns, ships, tanks, that sort of thing. But the result of that was there was a tremendous amount of unemployment in Germany after World War I. We're talking here in Michigan right now 10%, 12%, which is a very, very high number. The unemployment in Germany at the end of World War I was 50%. 1 out of every 2 persons was out of work. The German people were desperate. The German people were starving. There was not enough food for everyone, and the German people rioted. They wanted to overthrow the government, what's called the Weimar Republic, which was a very weak government. And there were 2 political parties that wanted to take advantage of this situation in Germany. One was the Communist Party, who had just overthrown the Tsar in Russia and put a man by the name of Joseph Stalin into power. And the other party was a party called the National Socialistic Labor Party, in short, the Nazi Party. And one of the leaders in that party was a man by the name of Adolf Hitler. And Hitler barnstormed all through Germany and promised the German people that if they put him and his party into power, he would restore Germany to the glorious land that it was before the war. He promised full employment. No one would be hungry. And in all of his speeches, he repeated one thing over and over and over. He blamed the Jewish people for all the ills that had befallen the Germans. He blamed the Jewish people for Germany having gotten into the war, for Germany having lost the war, for the unemployment, for the starvation. Keep in mind that at that time, the Jewish population in Germany was 1% of the total population. He practiced what became known later on in the world as the big lie. Big lie, the best definition is you tell a lie, you make it a big lie, and you repeat it over and over, and pretty soon it becomes the truth. And the German people were desperate, and they listened, and they put Hitler into power in 1933. At that time, I was around 7 years old, and usually when I say that, I hear the wheels clicking. If he was 7 years old, how old is this guy now? I'll save you the math. This guy is now 83. He's going to be 84 in a few weeks. The first thing I noticed was that I lost a lot of my playmates. I had a lot of friends who were not Jewish who would come to my house, or I was welcome at their house. And overnight, they no longer associated with me. Overnight, they would no longer come to my house. Overnight, I was no longer welcome in their house. Overnight, I turned from a friend into a dirty Jew. At the same time this was happening, stores began to have signs on their doors and on their windows saying, "Jews are not welcome here." Picture yourself going into a Costco or Walmart or Rite Aid and seeing a sign on the door saying, blacks are not welcome here, Catholics are not welcome here, Protestants are not welcome here. Hard to believe, but that's exactly what's going on. Park benches all through Germany were marked not for Jews. The newspapers, which became government controlled, which is a very, very dangerous thing to happen, were filled with anti-Semitic propaganda. The front pages, "The Jews are our misfortune. The Jews are defilers of our women." Terrible caricatures of Jewish people on the front page. Do not associate with Jews. Do not patronize Jewish stores. And that's pretty well the atmosphere in which I grew up for the first few years under Hitler's government. I should also point out to you, in case this was not pointed out to you on your tour, that one of the first things that Hitler did after he got into power, he literally killed and assassinated his political enemies, also some of his political supporters who he felt might be a threat to his power. Picture in this country one political party winning an election and then turning around and killing the leaders of the opposite party. Again, hard to believe. Maybe they'd like to do it, but it just isn't done in a democracy. After Hitler was finished with his political enemies, he turned on the Jews. Jews were no longer permitted to work for non-Jewish employers. If you were working in a store owned by a non-Jewish employer, or if you were just working for a non-Jewish boss, you were fired because you were a Jew. If you were, let us say, a doctor, you could no longer treat non-Jewish patients. And if one of your patients had to go into a hospital, you were not permitted to follow that patient into the hospital because Jewish doctors lost what was called hospital privileges in Germany. They could no longer work in any German hospital. If you, like my dad, were an attorney, you lost bar privileges, meaning you could not appear before any German court on behalf of your client. So it became almost impossible for Jewish people to survive economically, which was the idea of the whole thing. They could no longer support themselves, they could no longer support their families. So my dad very reluctantly decided he had to leave his beloved Germany. And I say beloved in every sense of the word, because when you've lived in a country for over 200-300 years, it's your homeland. And my dad was already in his 50s, and that's a very difficult decision to make, but you had no choice. You had to do that for the safety of family, and for your ability to support the family. So we applied for a visa to enter the United States of America. This is the land where we wanted to be. Land of freedom of speech, freedom of religion. If you worked hard, you could make a living. I didn't know much about the United States. When I was very little, I was still permitted to go to movies. After a while, that changed. Jewish people could no longer go to public places like movies or restaurants and so on. But I remember seeing a lot of American movies in my young days, and you haven't lived until you've heard John Wayne speak German. It's quite an experience. So all I knew really about this country were a lot of cowboys were chasing Indians, or a lot of Indians were chasing cowboys, and that's exactly what I expected to see when I came to this country. And we applied for a visa. Now, sometimes when I speak to people younger than you, I learned a lesson. Because the first time I said we applied for a visa, a hand shot up and a young man says, "Why did you apply for a credit card?" So I have to stop and explain. When I say visa, it's the legal permission to enter the country. And quite frankly, the United States did not want these people from Europe coming into the United States. A couple of reasons. One is the United States was going through what was called the Great Depression. They were afraid that people from Europe would come and take their jobs. Secondly, the United States was very isolationistic in those days. We had one great big ocean on one side, another great big ocean on the other side, and what happened on the other side of the ocean didn't matter, we thought. We were wrong. So it did throw a lot of obstacles in the path of Jewish people wanting to enter. For instance, you had to have a sponsor. You had to have someone in this country who was already a citizen, who would vouch that if you came here, you would not become a criminal, that you'd be able to support yourself, that you would not become a burden on the government. Of course, that requirement automatically eliminated thousands and thousands and thousands of people. But we were very fortunate. We had a sponsor. My dad had an uncle who came here long before the Hitler days, the early 1900s, and he settled of all places in South Dakota. And do not ask me why he went to South Dakota. I'll never know. And there he had a horse and he had a buggy, and he went from one little village to another, and he sold dry goods to the farmers and to the ranchers in South Dakota, and eventually ended up with a small dry goods store in Lemon, South Dakota, population 1,500. I Googled Lemon about a year ago. It is still population 1,500. Hasn't changed a bit. But he became our sponsor. The second requirement was that you had to pass a physical. And the physical was not used to permit you to come in. The physical was designed to keep you out. If you, for instance, had a cough at the time that you took the physical, that might be enough reason to turn you away. If you had a child with pink eye, and I'm not exaggerating, that would be enough to turn you away. There are stories told, literally, of mothers who licked the eyes of their children just before it was time for the physical to make certain that the eyes looked bright and looked shiny. The third requirement was that you were assigned a quota number, because only a very small number of people from each country in Europe were permitted to enter each day. And you were assigned a number, and you had to wait for that number to be called before you could take the physical. A number I'll never forget was my number, because frankly was my live or die number, was 10092. You will not be tested on that. I'm just trying to impress you with the fact how important this number was, that I still remember it after 70 years. We waited for our number to be called, and conditions continued to become very, very difficult. For instance, I, like all Jewish children, was kicked out of public school. We were no longer permitted to attend a public school in Germany. The Jewish community in Frankfurt opened up a small school for Jewish children, not a religious school, a secular school. We were taught the same things that we should have been taught in public school. It was not unusual for bricks to be thrown through the window of that school. It was not unusual for gangs to wait for us at the end of the day and beat us up. The police stood by and did absolutely nothing. We were not entitled to their protection. It got to the point where not only did I hate to go to school, I was afraid to go to school, because you never knew what the day to bring. Jews were no longer permitted to leave their homes except for a couple hours once a week to go to a store and buy their necessities. They said, as I said before, could not go to any public places, no restaurants, no theaters, no movies. So we waited for that number to be called, and finally, after 3 long years after we applied for a visa, we got that letter that we had been praying for, telling us to report for the physical. We were overjoyed. Now, we received that letter in September of 1938. The appointment for the physical was in January of 1939. Well, we thought a few more months waiting after waiting many years would not matter. How wrong we were. On the 9th of November, 1938, the principal came into my classroom and said, I want you to go home. Don't stop anywhere, don't speak to anyone, go directly to your homes. I hopped on my bike. I was about a half an hour bicycle ride from the school to my home, and I headed home. On the way home, I passed the synagogue, the house of worship, where my parents and my grandparents had worship, and it was in flames. It was burning to the ground, and the fire department was there. But their only job was to be certain that the buildings on either side did not catch fire. There made no attempt to put out the burning synagogue. I passed stores which were owned by Jewish merchants, where the windows had been smashed, the merchandise strewn into the street and the sidewalk, and the merchants were being dragged into the street and were being beaten. I passed men who were being forced to walk on the street with signs around their neck saying, I'm a Jew, I'm an enemy of the state. That was the beginning of a terrible 24-hour period which became known in history as the Night of the Broken Glass. In German it was called Kristallnacht. By the end of the next day, 10th of November, 1938, just a couple of weeks ago this month, there was not a synagogue in Germany that had not been desecrated, burned, destroyed. There was not a Jewish cemetery that had not been desecrated with stones overturned, graffiti written on the stones. Stores owned by Jewish merchants were damaged, destroyed. And thousands of Jewish men were rounded up during that 24-hour period and disappeared into concentration camp. The final number was 30,000. I came home that day. I was terribly frightened by what I had seen. I waited for my dad to come home, I guess to tell me that everything was going to be all right. My dad did not come home. Did not come home that night. He did not come home the following night. He too had disappeared. We had no way of knowing, was he alive, was he dead, was he in hiding? We just did not know. My mother, who maybe I recognize now more than I did then, was a pretty courageous lady, went to the police station. And you've got a picture that for a Jewish person to go to a police station in Germany at that time took a lot of courage. But she went to inquire about my dad, and she was literally pushed out of the station, and she was told, well, he's probably dead. And if he's not dead yet, he should be, and he soon will be. That's what she came home with. Days went by. We had no idea what had happened to my father. The police came to our house looking for him because he had been a prominent attorney in Frankfurt, and he was on the list of Jewish men to be arrested. They did not need warrants, not for us. I remember once they came at 4 o'clock in the morning and stood my mother and me against the wall while they searched the house, not believing that we had no idea where he was. I was around 12 years old by that time. Several weeks went by, and the date for our physical was getting closer, and we knew that if we could not keep that date, that we would be put to the end of the list, and we knew that by that time that would mean certain death. We were running out of time for a couple of reasons. One is World War II was about to break out, and once that started, no one would leave Germany to come to this country. Also not realizing that Germany had started to work on what they call the final solution to the Jewish problem, which is a polite way of saying the extermination of Jewish people all through Europe. And I should say, I really don't like to use the word extermination. It's too nice a word. When I talk extermination, I think of mice, I think of rodents. We're talking about killing human beings. That was the final solution to the German problem. About a week before we were due to report for the physical, we received a phone call from a gentleman who had been a colleague of my dad's, another attorney. He had been arrested on that 9th of November that I was telling you about, and he had been brought into a concentration camp called Dachau. You may have heard of that camp, one of the infamous German concentration camps. And he had seen my father there, still wearing the same clothing that he had worn when he was picked up on that 9th of November. Now, this gentleman was released because he was the child of a mixed marriage. One of his parents was Jewish, the other was not. At that time, that entitled him to be released. That law was changed. Later on, if you had Jewish blood in you going back 2 or 3 generations, you were considered a full Jew and were treated as a full Jew. The last thing he did upon his release, he gave my father his coat, because my father had no coat, and November over there is just as cold as November is over here. Well, my mother went into action. And this time she went to the Gestapo headquarters. How many of you are familiar with the term Gestapo? The German secret police, the dreaded German secret police. They don't wear uniforms, they don't issue traffic tickets. Their job was to enforce the Nazi regime's laws, enforce them in any way necessary. And for a Jewish person to voluntarily go to a Gestapo headquarters, best I can describe like a lamb going into a lion's den. You didn't know whether you're going to get out or in what condition you'd be. But she went. And she carried with her that letter that we had received from the American consulate saying that we had an appointment for a few days in physical. And she carried with her the medal that my father had been awarded in World War I to show that he had been a veteran fighting for Germany and wounded fighting for Germany. And it was her hope that this would cause them to release him long enough to keep the physical, get the visa, and leave Germany. I don't know whether you believe in miracles or whether you believe in God. I believe in God. She ran to one official who knew my dad. He had been a client of my father's in the pre-Hitler days when you could still go to any attorney of your choosing, including a Jewish attorney. And he respected my father. He says, what I will do, I will issue a temporary release from Dachau, from the camp, so that he can keep the physical, provided that he leave Germany within 48 hours after he passes the physical. Otherwise, we shall have to rearrest him and bring him back. We really had no way of knowing whether this man would or could keep that commitment. All we could do is wait and pray. I'm sure that all of you have some memory from your childhood, some event that stands out to this day, that lives with you, that sometimes flashes in your mind without any apparent reason. My memory is the night before we were due to report for the physical. The light went on in my bedroom, and my dad stood in the doorway. And it took me a second to recognize him. Hair had been shaved off his head. He was emaciated. You have seen pictures of concentration camp survivors. And the thing that I remember most of all, frankly, is tears were streaming down his cheeks. And in my 12 years, I'd never seen my father cry before. And that's a picture that stays with me to this day. We kept our appointment the next day at the American consul's office. My mother passed the physical. I passed the physical. The American doctor took one look at my dad's legs, which showed the remnants of the wounds that he had suffered 20-some years earlier. And he looked at my dad, who frankly looked awful. And he said, we can't grant him a visa. We don't think that he can support his family if we let him come to the States. This is where we ran into this idea of the physical being used to keep people out rather than keep them in. Keep in mind, I'm talking about a man who had successfully supported his family very comfortably for many years, who had been, if you recall, a skier and a tennis player. None of that mattered. I remember my parents literally pleading and crying for reconsideration. And finally, the American consul himself came out of his office and said, what I will do, if you're a sponsor in the United States, the one in Lemon, South Dakota, before the end of the day, we'll place $10,000 into an American bank to be certain that there are funds available for you if we let you come to the States. And if we receive word of that money having been placed, I shall issue the visa. In hindsight, I think it was rather hypocritical because I think he knew the odds of this falling into place were very remote. Several reasons. One is we didn't have email and all the other modern conveniences that we have today. If you had to make a long-distance phone call, particularly transoceanic, you went through a live operator, and you kept your fingers crossed that the call would go through. Secondly, there was several hours time difference, about a 6 or 7 hour time difference between Frankfurt, Germany, and Lemon, South Dakota. And thirdly, $10,000 in 1938 is, I would say, like $100,000 probably in today's money. So the odds were very much against us, but we tried. You had to try. You had to try because really it was literally a matter of life or death, a matter of survival. And we did reach my great uncle, and he said he would do his very best. And we spent a very long day on a very hard bench outside the American consul's office, hoping that things would fall into place.